All right, I'm Jack Donovan, and this is Pater, PH2T3R, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here again with CB Robertson, and we have a lot of conversations over DMs and so forth. I mean, I've known Christopher for a long time, and we have a lot of conversations that I'm like, this is a podcast. This is a deep conversation because he's a deep thinker, and we bounce ideas off each other all the time. And we know what each other are talking about vaguely. So we're going to start off with something he's been toying around with the concept of sorcery. But to get to sorcery, we need to talk about the myth of modernism.
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg as far as which one introduces the other. Because I've been toying with this idea of modernism, and modernism, as you've pointed out, and as many people intuitively go to, usually when people talk about it, refers to an artistic movement or an architectural movement. That's of course not what we're talking about here in relation to sorcery or magic or the lack thereof, depending on if you're in the modernist mindset or not. But I was sort of re-inspired to go back into it more recently after sort of putting the idea on hold for a year or so, because a certain James Lindsay has been going deep into alchemy, which is a form of sorcery, we might say. And for someone who lives in the sort of naturalistic, materialist frame, they'll say, well, that's just pseudoscience. That's like not a real thing. But the people who sort of created the worldview that we live in certainly did believe it was a real thing. So it takes, and for James Lindsay, that's really the alchemist that unlocks our current frame is Georg Hegel, the famous German philosopher who created the idea of a trajectory of history, of history as a kind of God, really. And so whenever you hear someone say, make an appeal to being on the right side of history, whether they know it or not, they're making a Hegelian argument. And so, this opens up a whole lot of questions about like, well, what even is magic or sorcery? And what does it look like if someone like Hegel is doing it? And what on earth is James Lindsay talking about? But the, cracking the myth of modernism, assuming modernism is even the correct term. I just haven't thought of a better term because it seems to be what all the postmodernists are post. It's what they've moved on from. So I'm happy to accept the term until something better comes along. But it seems like once you crack that and you understand what that worldview is built on, you find that it's built on magic. And even the rejection of magic is built on magic, and it makes the world a lot stranger and more interesting, and it changes your perspective on certain things that go on in our day-to-day civic life.
Well, like as you said, most people when they think of modernism, they think of an artistic movement, and obviously we're not talking about that. And the nit I would pick with this is like it almost seems like a slippery slope argument. Like if they make this change in history, then we end up here. Like in that sense, like that, like these things are not necessarily. Yes, they follow a train of idea. Like philosophy follows a train of ideas in certain ways. There's a progression of ideas, but doesn't mean that necessarily this had to end up here. No, and that's kind of the way it looks sometimes when we talk about this. Like Socrates said this, therefore Marxism. It ends up being like a little bit too
for sure. And a lot of it is, and this is the point that James Lindsay keeps reiterating over and over again, is that he talks about them in terms of Gnostic parasites. Right. They will always try to hop a ride on whatever ideology is dominant and make a version of it. And in fact, Hegel did this himself. Hegel, if you read the Wikipedia page on Hegel, it will say he was a Christian theologian. He was absolutely not a Christian theologian. he was a pagan who was opposing Christianity, but he was in fact taking Christian language and Christian concepts like the Trinity and reworking it into something completely different. But a lay Christian who's just going by the language wouldn't notice the difference. And so,
and you would have to do that in that era. It would be more socially acceptable to do that at that time period than it would be necessarily now.
Yes, perhaps. Although that language swap also happens now. It just has a different baseline. Right. And I mean, it would be unfair to say, Christianity necessarily leads to Hegelianism. Now, I have made the argument elsewhere that both Christianity and Hegelianism do naturally follow from a very precise notion of heroic idealism, which is kind of a different conversation. So there is some relation there. But insofar as there is a Hegel, you could say Hegel wasn't a Gnostic and that he didn't think we were, trapped in this evil prison of a world. Again, people who want to check out the Gnosticism thing, James Lindsay goes very, very deep in very many videos about that. But
yeah. And I pushed back on that when you first introduced me to it, because I was like, my understanding of Gnosticism is like Sophia, and that there's all these it's this kind of whole kind of subset of Christianity that's never appealed to me just aesthetically for that reason. But like I was aware of all these other things having to do with that, so I was like, what is this? Yeah. What do these two things have to do with it? But the way he explains it, it really. The idea, to encapsulate for people who haven't watched the 3-hour video, the way that he explains it is basically, they through what they're doing, they believe that they're going to unleash some kind of magical change in history if they just break everything apart. They're
going to cause the change. Yeah. And Hegel wasn't a break everything apart guy. That was the critical theorists who picked up his dialectic and took it, namely Marx, the young Hegelians, as they call themselves. There's the old Hegelians, the right-wing Hegelians, and I believe that they might have influenced the Manifest Destiny movement in the United States, which took place about the same time. Very Hegelian notion, but not in the left-wing ruthlessly criticize everything existing mode of thought there. Manifest Destiny is a very Hegelian appeal to the unfolding of the inevitable trajectory of history. And if there was one way to summarize the magic of Hegel, the sorcery of Hegel, if we want to say, it's to depict a desired trajectory as if it was inevitable. Right. And by depicting it as inevitable, you can actually cause it to happen, or perhaps cause the opposite thing that you want to happen. Another noted alchemist that people might recognize the name of is George Soros. George Soros wrote a book, which I read actually a couple weeks ago, called The Alchemy of Finance. And the core of his book is he's an interesting guy because he's one of the most wealthy, powerful men in the world. But he doesn't think of himself primarily as a financier. He thinks of himself primarily as a philosopher. And his big goal in life appears to be to advance this idea of reflexivity, that I can cause things to happen by pushing one way and then it will swing back the other way. Very dialectical, very like straight out of Hegel, or Marx, take your pick, or Rousseau or Kant for that matter. But the dialectic is a way of framing, like the way a psychologist or psychiatrist might provide a reframe for a client. They're providing reframes for the world in order to try to cause things to happen using language.
Well, I mean, that's pretty much every religion and all philosophy is framing, right? I mean, that's right. If you put it, I mean, and they're doing their own thing, but solar idealism is a frame. Here's a way to see the world. And it's all the thing about frame, and this is where the magic comes in that you're talking about, is the thing about frames is that they're never all exactly right. They're like, here's the way we've chosen to look at the world that we like the best. is basically what it is. I mean, that's the way Christians would do it. That's the way everybody else does it. Like, this is the way we've chosen to look at the world that we like the best, and we're going to make that true.
Yeah.
And then for simple people, they don't see the contradictions. They don't see like whatever. They're just like, well, that's true because my daddy told me it's true. But like, you know, like for more advanced people, they see that there are contradictions there. But like, you know, do you want to buck that system? Do you want to like, you know, you just go with the flow? I mean, if the king of England, I mean, in an alternate England where they're not gay, but in the king of England, if the king of England is put there by God, and which is theoretically what, you know, that's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
And you know, if he was put there by God to rule, that's where his authority comes from, which is magic. You know, like that's we've agreed that truth that is probably not true is true.
Yeah.
And therefore society, all of his rule and all of his power then comes from that. You know, like that's magic.
It's a tricky thing because people who want to oppose magic in defense of like objective truth or their worldview or whatever, exactly will run into the contradiction you're talking about. And I actually had a conversation with some Christians a few weeks back because I was delving into like, what is the etymology of like magic and sorcerer and stuff. And it turns out the Roman word for sorcerer is magus, plural magi. Okay. And I was like, wait, that's the three wise men, right? The three magi, the wise men of the East who come over, and they're very positive characters.
Every occult order calls himself.
Right. And so it's like, right, exactly. And so it's like, oh, what about that Deuteronomy or Exodus line prohibiting witchcraft and sorcery? What about thou shalt not suffer the witch to live? And you go into that and you're like, oh, it's like you're not supposed to do it. It's like the word was like pharmakos. So it's like basically don't be a drug dealer, don't like poison people. But it has other connotations. And basically it's like what's prohibited is bad magic. Like good magic is okay, but just don't do bad magic. Because when you think about it, like what a spell is when you're talking about I wanted to talk about books that supposedly counter sorcery, and one of them is Malleus Maleficarum by Heinrich Kramer, the famous Hammer of the Witches. And what's bad in sorcery is not that you're communicating with spirits, but the spirits you're communicating with. Like if you're communicating with Saint Michael, that's great, that's fine. Better make sure that is who you think it is and not a demon in disguise or whatever. Yeah. But it's the summoning of the devil that's not good. If you're talking to God, that's just prayer, which is fine.
Yeah, well, it's like Mexicans lighting their candles, all those little saint candles, because you know, when you go south of the border, then you know Catholicism gets very pagan very quickly, and you know, like they're doing magic. You go to these stores and whatever and buy things, you know, in Southern California and all these stuff. You can go to all these stores that sell different candles that you can light to fall in love or like to have different things, and that's all magic, you know. But as long as they're saints, then you're all right.
The funny thing about Catholicism, it's actually like idiosyncratically and geographically specifically pagan pretty much everywhere you find it. Like there are Catholic temples, churches in India where only Brahmas and Kshatriyas are allowed to perform certain rituals in the Catholic Church. Yeah. It's just kind of funny. But anyways, the magic we're concerned about here, because we're not talking about like magic to make your plants grow fast or whatever.
Right.
I think the best, like, suppose you're a normal person and you're like, I'm still not on board with all this magic stuff. Like, sell me on it. There's a book by an English philosopher named J.L. Austen called How to Do Things with Words. Very innocuous sounding title. And the book basically is in a very English fashion, tries to break everything down into categories. There's descriptive sentences like this drink is green. But there are like nonsensical actions, and there's a few that he doesn't mention. But among the categories of sentences one can utter are word acts. So I christened this ship the SS Anne Marie, or Another example he gives is, I'll
You just
bet
pull
you.
Anne Murray out of your ass.
Yeah.
Who says Anne Murray?
I don't know. Hey, what would an Englishman in the 1950s say? I was going to say I'll bet $10, but he said bet 6 pence. I'll bet some amount of money in whatever denomination is useful to you that it will rain tomorrow. I mean, assuming you're serious, that's a word act. You are creating something, not indirectly, like I'm influencing someone else who may be inspired or whatever. But my words, in effect, are an action. Or, I bequeath my library to my oldest son in a will. That is a word act. The classical example from his book is, I now pronounce you man and wife. In the context, or the bride or the groom saying I do. I would add, to pertinent to the discussion of modernism, a judge banging the gavel and saying guilty or not guilty is a word act. And what all of these things have to do, and I don't think J.L. Austen says this, but this is sort of my own thought, is that they have to do with legitimacy, which sort of goes back to the divine right of kings idea, or the vote. We could consider a democratic vote to be a giant collective word act of a kind. Why does everyone writing these things down? Another rabbit hole, but yes. Understanding these word acts and how they work, because it's not obvious in a mechanistic sense why a word act should be taken seriously by anybody, And
one of them, the most popular one right now, the one that is making everyone's head blow up, is like, women have penises.
Oh yes,
some women have penises, and by saying that, the magic word over and over again, that's making it true. And you've said it enough times that now it's like, people will accept that as absolute truth because you've said those magic words, and therefore, she says she's a woman, therefore she's actually transformed herself in like a transubstantiation kind of fucking way that like now she's a woman, like now this dude is a chick and he's not in the women's dressing room for other reasons. And but that's the kind of magic that you're talking about. I think that a lot of people are doing and engaging in right now. Is like, we're going to do this, cast this spell on you basically by saying this over and over and over and over again and repeating it. And therefore you will start to accept that is real. And that's going to become a reality. And really the divine right of kings and all that, that's the same thing. It's like that king, God put that king there. God put that king there. Yes, God put that king there. Get everyone to say it, nod the heads, and now it's real. And as long as no one says that's bullshit, then everybody's like, it's true. That is truth now.
The oldest story, the emperor has no clothes.
Yes.
The two sorcerers, we might say, who spun magic clothes from gold and then vanished. A model that has been taken up by many these days. Yeah. But before some conservative, might jump in and say, well, clearly magic is just an obfuscation to objective reality, and we should just, do away with that. I mean, there is some truth to the leftist idea that gender roles are somewhat constructed, at least as far as how we talk about it. Now, obviously, sex is not, and they're totally wrong about that. But like the expectations that we have as far as how to optimize our fulfillment of our sex roles is inherited knowledge that is held up in a social manner. And so, if some portion of that is magic, if some of our masculine ideals in myth help us to do that and saying, well, let's just do away with magic and sorcery and then we'll be better off. It's not actually clear that's the case. And a one that would maybe be more immediately and intuitively appealing to conservatives, for example, is the existence of borders. Libertarians are often very fond of saying, oh, it's just magic lines in the ground. What do those mean? They are magic lines in the ground. Guess what? There are guns that enforce those magic lines. Right. And the fact that they are, or there aren't, as the case may be, depending on whose
yeah.
magic is stronger in the given time, I suppose.
Right.
Some countries have stronger magic in that realm. But whether you want to say the magic is real or not, it like the magic guides where the guns are pointed and how many of them are. Right. And like, so the rejection of magic, and this is where the subject of magic goes back to modernism. The rejection of magic is itself a component of modernism and a faith in human reason. Let's put our different religions, our different magics aside, and then we can resolve our conflicts amicably. And most people, when we talk about what we're describing as modernism, trace it back to the Enlightenment, namely to René Descartes and his beginning of like philosophically exploring things from the bedrock up. We're not going to begin with any first principles at all, other than not even my own existence, not God, although he kind of weasels that in later, not even myself. And that's really putting reason at the bedrock. And the Enlightenment didn't actually begin in the 16th, 17th century. It sort of took off from there because that was about the time that a bunch of ancient Greek and Roman texts were rediscovered. And what we know as the Enlightenment in many ways can go back to ancient Greece. And my own theory on this is that there was a particular drama, a story by a playwright named Aeschylus that transformed justice itself. And the play is a trilogy called the Oresteia, but the final act, the final play is called Eumenides, which is Greek for those of good intentions. And the play is about this just absolutely horrific, brutal blood feud, an intrafamilial blood feud. So it's worse than a normal blood feud. There's like Montagues and Capulets. There's like whatever the American one was with the pig. But
Hatfields and McCoy.
The Hatfields and the McCoys. Yeah. But this one, the Oresteia, is about Agamemnon sacrificing his own daughter, Iphigenia, to get his fleet to sail to Troy to get the right winds to do that. So he's away at Troy for 20 years. When he gets back, his wife has not forgiven him for that. She welcomes him in and then kills him. So there's already one vengeance line there. But then Agamemnon's son, Orestes, then kills his mother, his father's wife, Clytemnestra. So there's a double burn, and there's even more intrafamilial blood before Agamemnon even begins. But so Clytemnestra's ghost arises and awakens the Furies, Erinnues. They're the spirits, these older than the gods, and extremely powerful too. Spirits of vengeance that will follow people until they are either killed or driven insane. And these are, they pursue Orestes, and he takes refuge in a temple, and Athena intervenes and says, no, we're gonna stop this cycle of violence, which is exactly what she does at the end of the Odyssey too. She stops a cycle of violence right as it's about to start in Ithaca. And she holds the first trial in history. 13 jurors, herself being the 13th. And in the end, in a 7-6 verdict, they say Orestes is not guilty of matricide. But in order to persuade the Furies to accept this, and she says, what you're doing is not real justice. This vengeance is not real justice. I can give real justice. And that redefinition of justice, at least implied in the text, is sort of the nature of what magic does and what it is. I think there was a very real case to be made prior to that in fact justice is vengeance. And when you read Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra and his famous line with the tarantulas, they are equated in that way. Those who speak highly of their justice are in fact pursuing vengeance, because that's what justice is vengeance. And people in the past seem to speak of justice not as some high and noble civic virtue, but as a kind of awful and powerful force to be acknowledged and respected and feared. And feared. You would sacrifice a lot to ward off the threat of justice, which is sort of what's implied by the first word of the Iliad as well, menace. There's a long, etymological deep dive to do off that too. The divine's indiscriminate sanction for violating the divine hierarchy, as Leonard Milner says. So there's so much packed into these concepts of justice that we take for granted today, but weren't always the case in the past. And so, anyways, to go back, I hope I'm not going too fast, but Aeschylus seemed to transform the very idea of justice. And what's funny is he never actually defines what it is very clearly. It's left as this kind of vague, high notion. And when, 200 years later, you see, Plato trying to, in his magnum opus, The Republic is about one question: what is justice? And it doesn't answer that question. It's, they have this massive, long, it's a thick book,
Yeah, it is.
It's, and they have this huge long dialogue that they construct an entire city in order to get a better idea of what justice would look like. And they have all these arguments. Is justice really what's just in the interest of the stronger, as Thrasymachus argues? Sort of early prelude to Nietzsche and Ragnar Redbeard, but 2,000 years prior. And that's rejected, but a clear answer isn't given. And what happens is the reader is left with this like dazzled, vague feeling of the superiority of being the just man and the righteous man, but without really an idea of what that entails, other than it's good to pursue that. It is an extraordinary work of sorcery, and I would call that good sorcery or good magic, white magic. Because it has a positive effect. The whole purpose of the Republic was Plato had Socrates trying to talk his brother out of being this very like passionate wannabe politician, and say, maybe it's better to live the private contemplative life. But the idea that we see represented in Aeschylus is we can put aside our desire for vengeance and transform that desire into a different idea. James Lindsay talks a lot about this German word aufheben, which means to reject, but also to keep at the same time, to sublimate. And that is exactly what Aeschylus does with the idea of justice. He's sublimated, he's aufhebened this concept, which is why, when we, see a court trial happen and we think, the outcome is maybe not satisfying to us in some way. We're like, that guy, he diddled a kid. He should be executed. They only gave him 15 years and then there's like 10 years of probation. We're not really satisfied with that, but there's a sense that justice is being kept up somehow.
You used the word that I was actually going to point out when you were talking about it a little bit earlier. And it seems satisfaction is a good word for that. And that's what it's like two parties are angry. Are you okay with that? All right. Are we good? If you were trying to strap a fight between two guys, can we settle this? Are you okay? You say you're sorry. You say you're sorry. Are we good?
Yeah.
Are we good? Are we satisfied? And that's kind of what it is. It's mediating that satisfaction, and not that satisfaction is necessarily, it's equated with fairness, but I don't know if it's really, if you can one-to-one that.
It is equated to something that it isn't, and that's the magical act.
Yeah. And I think that we should, point out, I think, because we're talking about magic in terms that people don't think of magic in. Because when we talk about magic, when most people talk about magic, a lot of people who actually believe in magic, are going to be talking about either being in contact with forces in the universe that can manipulate reality.
Yeah.
Well, whereas we're talking about words that are manipulating psychology to a certain extent, whereas they're thinking about words that manipulate physical reality. Right. I'm going to send a magical dragon to get in your head overnight. That's what people think of as magic, and that's why they scoff at it, because they're like, well, I've never seen it. As many of my friends would say, does your magic stop bullets? It doesn't really.
Some of it does, actually, but not literally in quite that direct of a sense. But
right. But that's what people think of, and that's why when people say magic, when you use the word magic, people will be like, what are you talking about?
Those people. It is important to say that those people say, "Well, will your magic stop bullets?" Mm-hmm. Would be, if they're in their right minds, terrified not just to pull out their gun, but possibly even to bring their gun. Where some of these magicians have been at work. I'm thinking of specific cities where
Portland. That's why I left.
Right.
Because when you don't believe that your right to self-defense actually is real,
and it isn't,
because there's going to be a DA that's going to make you guilty no matter what, even if you were totally in the right. If someone with Texas would be like, well, obviously he was right.
And who are those DAs? Who are those DAs hired by? Or funded by? Right. Yeah. The alchemist, did his magic stop bullets? I think it did. Maybe not all the bullets, but he might have stopped your bullets.
Yeah. And obviously, but not directly in the same way that people were thinking about in the way that Doctor Strange would stop your bullets.
Well, sure.
That's the break with people when they use that word.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a fun story I love about ninjas from Japan, where this town is being a messenger arrives in the town representing a general with 5,000 men, and he says, "We are going to come and take your town unless you give us half of your rice every year." And the town's like, "We will freaking starve if we do that." And so they put it off, and finally one of the leaders from the town's like, "Well, we would just get wiped out by these guys, so we need to do something." And he has heard of a ninja village nearby, and so he goes off to consult the ninjas, and they make him wait for 10 days, and finally they say, "Yes, you'll work with you. We'll in 6 months' time, we'll go and make our move, and you'll hear one more message from this general, and then he'll not be a problem anymore." And 2 years go by, and he hasn't heard anything from either one. And then finally, I don't remember the proper punchline of it all, but it turned out the general was a creation of the ninjas in the first place. It's and I get this sense that many of the what you might call Harry Potter depictions of magic are themselves disguise is almost too strong of an intention word, but they obscure how magic actually works and how it has worked historically, and the serious people who actually make things happen in a very big way in the world, like George Soros, like Georg Hegel, Harry Potter magic is not what they're talking about. What big powerful magician sent an actual fireball that anyone's ever known? I don't know. But I can point to people who I can guarantee are occultists. I don't know this with certainty, but I'm 99% sure that Scott Adams is an occultist, and a good kind. He's fighting against George Soros and those types. He's a cartoonist, which is a very interesting middle ground in this whole thing. And Georg Hegel was using ideas. And when someone like Scott Adams says that, we need to, decouple from China, economically, and then 2 years later that's happening. If that's not magic because he said it and because of how he said it and what he built up to make that happen, or if he says, you know, in 2019 we should go to war with the Mexican drug cartels, and then a couple years later, you know, I think, was it RFK? It was, or DeSantis. Like, we have presidential candidates now talking about going to war with the cartels because of something a sorcerer said 2 years ago. You know, like that is like, to me, that's real magic. And the like the physical magic of fireballs and you know, World of Warcraft magic or Harry Potter magic is like it's like an escapism. That is to real magic what, like, I don't know, like video games are to real war fighting. You know,
which would be interesting. I mean, I think that I'm gonna get in trouble, but
we're in trouble here already. But
I'm always
going off.
I've been in trouble for fucking 15 years. But no, I mean, like that would probably equate closer to, I would say, Anton LaVey's later sense of what magic is, not his probably earlier sense of magic, what magic was, when he was a little kookier in the 60s, but his later kind of right wing kind of version of what magic was later in his thing, when he was into he was always into Might of Right because he plagiarized it, but it's you know, I mean, that was kind of, and that was what attracted me to that originally when I was younger, much younger. It's a long time ago.
Wikipedia. Yeah. Oh, it's edgy, and it's attractive because it's legitimacy defying, which is kind of fun. It kind of
Well, I mean, what they were saying a lot of times, one of the things that I thought was really well based in it, and it's still not wrong, is, you know, like you know, if you were really good at magic, you'd be really successful. You know, if you really, I mean, they said that kind of stuff all the time. If you're really good at magic, most of those guys aren't, but like if you're really good at magic, you'd be really good at successful. And you know, like, 'cause that's what I mean.
Average Stellamite, George Soros. Yeah,
right. Andrew Tate.
Yeah,
I mean,
doesn't he have an official wizard in his little inner circle crew?
I don't know.
It's like him, his brother, and they have some. I'm pretty sure he has a wizard in his like inner core who's like his number 3 or something. I'd have to verify that. But
yeah, I mean, what you're getting back to really, and what he's good at, what a lot of people are good at. What Hitler was good at is probably
another esotericist.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, him. But I mean, you know him. We know Himmler was, but and then the other guy, the really weird looking one, who did all his propaganda. I forget what his name was, but is super ugly, like like next level ugly. But he was Hitler's propaganda guy. And what a lot of people don't know, I think, because they haven't read it, they just hear that it's bad. And I have to say, because, you know, I went into Barnes and Noble when you still bought books in the store, and, you know, I bought the Satanic Bible. Oh, I'm being bad, you know, whatever. And then you know, when I really felt bad was when I picked up Mein Kampf. I was like, oh, I'm being bad, you know. But then but if you read it, actually, like, aside from it being, you know, what it is and very tiresomely about the Jews, there's whole chapters of fucking propaganda of like how to do propaganda, which is, you know, I don't think a lot of people realize that that's a lot of what he was interested in. And propaganda is what we're trying, like, how
he was obsessed with
an entire
cinema.
nation of people to do that, you know, like, you know, like to become this thing. I mean, that was a lot of magic that was happening there, you know?
Oh, yeah. Sort of related, but a side question. If we assume that all like frameworks of legitimacy are founded in magic and therefore the work of some sorcerer, the question then is like, well, who is the sorcerer with the United States? Who is our founding sorcerer? It wasn't Washington. He was more of just a general and a patriot landowner, part-time inventor and stuff. The Scott Adams argues it was Ben Franklin.
That's what I would have guessed.
Ben Franklin, the older man, not super attractive, but somehow strangely still popular with ladies much younger than himself.
Yeah.
Did some weird stuff, sunbathing naked, involved in some very edgy, dark, the Hellfire Club and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
Very popular, skillful, extremely skillful writer and pamphleteer, and could turn a phrase better than just about anybody.
Yeah.
He was arguably the sorcerer that made America work. Not the only person, obviously. You had, John Adams, severely underrated guy, Hamilton, Jefferson, the rest. But, there does seem to be a sorcerer at work in a lot of these places.
They were all kind of, in their way, they were Masons, right? But
that's true.
They were kind of into ritual magic, like they did a little bit of that. Just reading Washington's biography and stuff. Dude knew the power of riding in a town on a horse, and what his outfit needed to look like, and what he needed to project out of himself so that he could be the thing. That's the kind of stuff that always interests me. That I think a lot of people poo or whatever. But why I've always been friends with Tanner Guzzi, and we always have always gotten along really well, is because we understand that clothing is magic.
Yeah, and I want to be careful not to offend by calling people sorcerers who A, are not, and B, would hate being thought of in that way.
Right.
Because if you exist within a hierarchy, within a society, and you take up those values and you embody them really well, you wear your uniform exactly right. You know how to say according to what's expected. You're Pericles giving the funeral oration. Or I'm sorry, that's not Pericles. The funeral oration of Pericles. You hit the notes just right and do all that. You're living within the frame. You're not creating the frame,
right?
Which is a crucial difference. And if you're living within that frame and you're embodying all those values, excellently, you're not a sorcerer. You're just a really awesome person, But the sorcerer is the one who either is creating the frame, is creating the value, or who is trying to break the system so that they can then create their own.
Well, that's where it gets into white magic and black magic, and I think that's why I push back a little bit on the word sorcerer, because mythologically speaking, whenever we see sorcerers,
it's always evil.
They're always evil. The sorcerers are the outsiders. I was literally my project for this week has been to read all the Agni verses in the Rig Veda, and all the Agni hymns, and whenever they talk, whenever the word and it's a translation, granted, but whenever the word sorcerer is used, it's the people that have done the dirty, guileful, sleazy thing that we don't like,
right?
And that's the impure people who are a different religion, and believe different things,
and are trying to make their religion into the main religion.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the bad guys, and so we don't want that. I think because if you're in an ordered frame, because we're kind of relating this back to solar idealism and the idea of words creating order. Because men want to live in an ordered world. We want to live in an ordered world that, yes, and that's where it gets into king, magician, Mitra Varuna kind of category is that kings draw lines and they make the rules and with the help of advisors and whatever. And so that's how they create the world, is they draw those magical boundaries and magical lines and all that kind of stuff. And that's, most men want to live in a world where those lines exist, because otherwise it's chaotic and disordered. So it can't be a bad thing. It can't be a bad thing. It just depends which side of society you want to live in and which team you're on. The idea of what we're seeing right now is a breaking apart of order that I think is almost universally understood. That when we get into things of beauty is
science,
beauty is ugliness, weakness is strength, and men and women are the same. Things that have always been true in every society. Breaking kind of eternal truths. which is obviously, this game that you're talking about that the, Marxists and neo-communists or whatever are playing. But we want to have those, like we want to have those magical things, like what is beauty? Because that's the thing is that they're doing, and this is what a lot of the art world did and so forth. Not so much
totally.
in modernism, but definitely in postmodernism, and the art that everybody hates now is like what is beauty really? And what is da, 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 da. I mean, that's where you go to art school. You're like I'm challenging myself to think
blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, like that's Malevich, I think, off the top of my head, like the famous like square. Yeah,
I forgot that's actually a real thing. I was just
no. It's I think it's Russian. Like the early like Russian constructivists, I think. There's all kinds of art things that people did. I think without getting too nerdy about it, that with the advent of photography, I think a lot of that changed art a lot, and it became a lot about, well, I have to do something aside from paint pictures, because cameras do that now. Yeah. And so then what does the artist do, and what is his function? And that, then it's about ideas. And so that's questioning ideas, and sometimes the questions are good, and sometimes they're just bullshit, and it's just the idea of like, what I've been joking about with somebody the other day, was just about like, on Twitter, I was talking to actually Ethan. We were making fun of the people who, do the vulnerability is strength and up is down. And it's all, Bronson was in the conversation too, actually, about, contrarian marketing. Because contrarian statements work. They're great hooks. If you say something that isn't like maybe protein isn't all that is, the thing that everybody acknowledges is good, say it's not good. And then even if you're actually going to say that it's good at the end, they're going to read your whole email. What are they saying?
They're either curious or they want to hate watch it. One of the two. And if they watch it all the way around, that they've already forgotten their initial hateful response because you've got them hooked anyways.
Exactly. And that's so much of marketing. And we live in this society that's kind of driven by that, because you have all these guys and influencers having to do that like 24. They have to keep coming up with new shit to keep people's attention. So it ends up being nonsense talk, like a lot of like silliness, and that's the vulnerability of strength thing that's like linguistically just wrong.
And I would say that's the value of philosophy as opposed to sorcery. Is it does help you cut through a lot of those games like very quickly. But a couple points. One of the things that Curtis Yarvin has pointed out is that as black-pilled as people can be about propaganda and stuff, he says when you go back and look at the propaganda from World War II, you're like, this is really childish. This is like this would not convince an 8th grader today. We as a population, we've gotten a lot better at seeing through a lot of the propaganda. Now the propaganda has gotten a lot more sophisticated to sort of in tandem with our own sophistication. But then he says, and then if you go back to World War I, it's just grotesque cartoons. It's like them bad, us good. It's like this would not even persuade a 7-year-old, today.
Although, you can go on Twitter or whatever, I'm always amazed at like what their caricatures of like Republicans or like or vice versa, to be fair.
That's true,
but I mean, they're very cartoonish, like they're all in the South and they hate everybody. And it's very silly. I mean, they could draw a cartoon of that person and
that's true.
Well, isn't that what memes are?
Yeah, very much.
Memes are cartoon propaganda, really. Like who's the crying guy, and there's the whining crying guy, and then like the Chad dude with the
I always love the
blonde beard,
the virgin Chad ones, and I like the ones that are like they start to break the fourth wall. There's like the Chad virgin, and then there's the virgin Chad, and you actually can't tell which one they're making fun of anymore, and then maybe they're just making fun of the whole meme format, but it's not totally clear. Right. Those got really fun for a little bit, but I still try to avoid those. But I guess to me, that goes back to the sorcery versus magic. One's good, one's bad. Because at the end of the day, the skill set required to build as an archetypal solar father is a very similar skill set to the one you'd need to break that down and to undermine it. It's very similar. Just like it takes a thief to know a thief, or the famous Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, sheep, wolves, and sheepdog. The sheepdog is a lot like the wolf and looks a lot like a wolf to the sheep. It's very to people who are very, very suspicious of sorcery or who don't believe it at all. It can be very tempting to reject the skill set entirely rather than to figure that out and say, all right, how do I use this to defend what I think is good? And to spot the attempts to undermine things.
Well, it's really about, I think, the difference between, let's say magic and sorcery. Is it, I think that most people, if you were going to be, we could be completely arbitrary and beyond good and evil, and you could be nothing's real and whatever, or we could go that route, or you can look at the intent, and what is their intent in using the sorcery? Like, is the intent creating prosperity, and like prosperity and freedom, or is it not that? Is it the opposite of that? Does this, and all of them will say you have to play, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, but that's the reality of it at that game. And that's why leadership is a weird thing. But I do think, I would like to think that there are people who have a benevolent intent in using sorcery. And that's really what a lot of Marvel movies are about, a little bit. Like there's always kind of something like that in there. But is it benevolent? Are you going to use your powers for good, like to help people, or are you going to use your powers to gain more power?
Right. Exactly.
And I think that, personality wise, I hate this scale more than anything, but I think your gamma sorcery is the difference.
Yes,
because that's a lot of times what it is. Well, there's the sneaky guy in the background pulling strings and moving things around to put himself in a position of power that he didn't really earn, except by being sneaky and going around corners and he has no good intentions whatsoever, except for to empower himself and make himself important.
Well, and if your sole goal is building up your own power further, that is a symptom of not having a worldview at all. And so it is sort of antithetical to building something. Because if you are building a broader worldview outside yourself, you're necessarily expending energy. You're not just accumulating like some dragon,
Yeah. Well, even an Alexander kind of character there's a dream.
Yes.
You're selling people on a dream. And you're creating a world that doesn't exist yet. You're like sending people into battle for a world that doesn't exist yet, because I'm going to do this thing that's going to be marvelous when we get there.
Yeah, exactly. And intent is kind of tricky because, some of the people I would say are evil in an objective way, like not just bad, but evil, will say and might even believe that they have the best of intentions. There's that famous, I think Daniel Dennett says, if there is anything we learned from the 20th century, it's that, good intentions aren't enough. Contra Aeschylus, perhaps. Eumenides is not sufficient. He says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But I think with Nietzsche still on our tongues, his thing was not intentions, but what's the kind of person here? Because if you might not be able to read someone's intention, or they might not even be able to read their own intention, but there's and maybe Mishima was more explicit about this, but there are certain kinds of personalities, and you can tell visually what sort of person often is, what their intents are, whether someone is an alpha in the Vox Day sense, or if they're a gamma in that hierarchy. You can tell gammas visually. There's a look associated.
I wish I could tell them quicker.
Right.
you're right. When you go back and look, you're like, it was right there.
Yeah.
But sneaky fuckers. Well, which is the evolutionary theory part of it is sneaky fuckers. Like the guys who like when the alphas are gone, they fuck your like girlfriend. But like your monkey or whatever. But yeah, I mean, like a lot of times they do present the signals, but I'm thinking one particular person that we both know. I can think of two people that we both know, but one in particular, like the evidence is he appears to be exactly what he is. And the magic, the real sorcery is that no one believes it. Like once you've dealt with him, like, and once he's fucked you over, but and you're like, this literally, it's like an animal that is like, has the markers of a venomous animal. Like you can see it, but like the magic is this extreme charisma that covers it up, and a lot of times that is the case with these kind of characters. Sometimes it's not, sometimes they're just creepy generally, but like get to whisper in the right, what's that, the one from Lord of the Rings that everybody refers to?
Grima Wormtongue. There we go.
Yes. I mean, there's that kind of guy, who is, again, is visually exactly what he looks like.
And then there's Saruman with the booming voice.
Yeah.
As well. There's both kinds. Yeah. And that's more of a, that's almost more of a direct power, like that's it. Whereas the indirect, like whisper in your ear kind of power, that's a certain kind of guy. Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's a fascinating subject. And we've mentioned Nietzsche a few times. Someone asked me on Instagram a few days ago, like, you've talked about Nietzsche in reference to sorcery. Don't you think Nietzsche would be an example of a sorcerer declaring God is dead and all this? And I thought that was a very funny question and an interesting one. And I think there's a sense in which that might be true, because he was trying to bring about his ideas of the Übermensch, and his notion of eternal recurrence has some interesting implications in what it counters as well as what it advances, and his own vision. But
the ballsiness to write a book in the voice of a prophet is my favorite thing about him. I hold my beer. I'm gonna write a book in the voice of a prophet, and you're gonna take it seriously because it's good, and it's gonna probably change the world.
And did,
pretty substantially, and not with the God is dead thing, but with all the other stuff.
Exactly.
So, but anyway, I know we have to wrap up here, so I'm not gonna talk you off because I know you have a hard stop, but we will pick this up another day soon. We'll just kind of keep doing this because I think this is more than you can talk about in 1 hour.
Oh yeah. Well, and all these things have to get, like, I don't expect, 80% of the people who hear this podcast, as intriguing as it might be, to be like, to walk away and be like, all right, sorcery is real now. I guess it's time to live in that new world. It takes some time for these ideas to set in, if they are believed, but there is a lot to unpack here for sure. And again, the J.L. Austen book, How to Do Things with Words, and the idea of a word act. Because, people in libertarian circles are often fond of saying, oh no, words are never actions and actions are never just words. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, if you believe in spells, your opinion might change a little bit.
Yeah.
Or if someone accuses you of rape, like, will that never hurt you?
Yeah. No. Words definitely hurt. I've gotten red press. I know what that is. But anyway, So it's great going over this, and we will continue it soon. And everybody watching, watch for the next one. All right, stay solar.
Pater is the cultural arm of the Order of Fire. For more, visit PH2T3R.com.